And I'm sorry, I have little one in the background here, so apologies if he pops up. So it should be starting recording. So I'm going to go ahead and get us going here. So first, some introductions. I am Sarah Roberts, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for Benton Soil and Water Conservation District. And I also have my colleague Donna with us today. If you want to introduce yourself, Donna.
I'm Donna Schmitz, a resource conservationist with the Benton Soil and Water Conservation District.
Thanks. And then we're also joined by Chrissy, who's going to be leading this webinar, who doesn't work with us, unfortunately, but is a close partner in a lot of what we do in her work. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Chrissy, to introduce yourself and sort of share a little bit about what you do, and then we can get rolling.
All right, so I am going to share my screen. So if someone can let me know, I have multiple screens, so sometimes it gets a little crazy what screen I'm actually sharing. So if that looks good, let me know. If it looks very random, also tell me. But I'm Chrissy Lucas, or Chrissy Lucas Woodruff, and I am an outreach program coordinator with the OSU Extension Service. And part of my job over about the last 20 years has really involved working with domestic well and septic system owners. So those rural residents that rely on those two systems for clean drinking water and their treatment of their waste from their household. So I love being invited by places like the Soil and Water Conservation District to come have a chat with folks. Just to relay a little bit of information. It's really important to remember that everybody's wells and septic systems are a little bit different. But kind of tonight, my kind of goals for you are to talk a little bit about groundwater, some of those water quality issues that we see that are pretty common. Now, I say pretty common. There are water quality issues I'm sure folks on this call have with their wells that are not common because, like I said, wells are a little bit different. So I'm always happy to talk with individuals about their individual test results and what works best for them. But kind of as a whole, I really like to focus on the water quality issues that can actually cause health effects, because we do have a couple of those in our region. And then I really want to talk to you a little bit about your well, what they should look like, what parts there should be there, because not all wells are built the same, and then a little bit about maintenance. And then, you know, water is one of those things that you don't know what's in it until you really have it tested. And then my favorite part is talking about septic systems, because I love talking about poop, and it's a little harder for me on a webinar because I don't get to see all of your faces turn a little bit red. But everybody poops, and septic systems are really kind of a part of life, and until, you know, they're kind of out of sight, out of mind until something goes wrong. And then just kind of at the end, I for sure will like follow up on any questions you have, and I do have the chat open.
Yes. And so Chrissy, before you launch into it, I actually have a really quick poll that I'm going to launch right now to help us kind of learn a little bit about who all's here and kind of everyone's experience with some of these systems. So you should be able to answer these questions. Does everyone see a prompt for some questions?
I see it, so
okay, great.
It must be good.
So we should have some data that starts coming in here. And this is just asking for the, you know, if the font looks really small and you're kind of straining. The first question is asking how long you've lived with a drinking water well for. The second is how long you've lived with a septic system for. And then we're also just wondering if you've ever worked with us at Benton SWCD in any capacity. All right, some answers coming in. I love getting this data. It's always so interesting to see the audience that we get. It's great to learn more about who's interested in kind of what we do and our services. Looks like we have some folks also just now joining this webinar. So welcome to those just hopping in. You should hopefully be able to get right into the poll that's currently running. Oh, another person, welcome. So if the poll is on your screen, hopefully you can go ahead and answer that. Let's see. Looks like maybe we're close to collecting answers. Okay, so it looks like actually many of you have at least a long time that you've lived with wells and septic systems. So the vast majority actually of our participants have lived with wells and septic, they said more than 5 years. So that's great that you're still interested in learning. I feel like that's probably a big learning curve. Just a little personal anecdote. I just literally last weekend moved to some property with a well and septic, and that's the first time that we have ever had that in my family too. So I'm here to learn along with you. And then it looks like actually about half of you have worked with us at the Soil and Water Conservation District before, so that's great. Okay, I'm going to share out. I stopped the poll, so now you should be able to see all these answers if you're curious about the data. All right, I'm going to end the poll here. And hopefully that is that gone from everyone's screen now?
Yes, I think
Okay,
so.
great. Okay. All right, I'm going to let you keep on going, Christy. Thanks for letting me pause to collect some data.
Yeah, I like people to think about it for a few minutes before we launch in. And also it gave me time to look at all the names. So there's definitely some names on there that I am familiar with. Folks out there that are very busy in our community. So I appreciate that they took such a beautiful evening off to come learn about wells and septics. All right. So kind of the first thing, I just want folks to kind of understand what groundwater is. And it is one of those things, these are both systems that we're talking about that we can't see, right? So like you go out and you look at your place where your drain field is, or you see your wellhead, you can't see what's going on under the surface. So I just want you to kind of think about a couple of things. Is that first, that top, when we're digging a hole and we hit the water table, we've actually hit kind of the first aquifer. And really it's just a saturated zone. So it's not like an underground lake, like it's not, free in there. There's a lot of pieces of soil and boulders and that kind of thing. And really the water's just filling the spaces around those. So just keeping that in mind, this is kind of how it would look. And then there is actually a flow with groundwater. So it's not that it rains and the water hits the surface of the soil and starts percolating through all those layers and then gets to the aquifer. It actually moves down, but it also flows maybe towards like a drainage basin. We talk about that. We all live in the Willamette Valley, or I would hope most of us do. And so as that water moves down, it also will kind of move towards the center of wherever our drainage basin is. So more frequently in the middle of a valley, you might see something like a river. And so those rivers actually are not just fed by surface water, they actually have groundwater that feeds them from the bottom. And then I mentioned, the top of the water table was the first aquifer. That's what we kind of consider those unconfined aquifers. And it's kind of a weird word to say, unconfined. It just means that there's no barrier, right? There's just the soil. That's all that is really treating that water or helping clean out any sort of contamination that might have been picked up by that water's on the surface. And then we have something called confined aquifers, and those tend to be a little bit deeper. And those confining layers can be like something like a layer of heavy clay. It could be a layer of rock. And those aquifers do interact with one another, but maybe it's like small micro cracks, things like that, or areas where, the water is moving along in the aquifer very slowly. And then you get to kind of the end of a heavy clay layer, and there's a spot where those aquifers can interact. So kind of thinking about it, most of our wells, we hope, are maybe a little bit deeper and are in kind of that confined aquifer. So there's more protection between the surface of the soil and where we're pulling our water from. So the shallower your well is, you tend to have a lot more surface to groundwater interaction. And that's where we really start to see some of the water quality issues kind of in the valley, is that surface to groundwater interaction, because everything is connected in some way. So why is it so important? For you guys, it's your sole source of drinking water, I would imagine, and that's pretty important. But when we look at this, it's about 23% of all Oregonians, and this number changes a little bit. You know, but you do a little quick math on 23%, the current population of Oregon, and this could be almost 1 million people. So that's pretty significant. And then we're an ag state, so of course we're using it for like irrigation. And typically when we're talking irrigation like that, those are water right wells. Those are not our domestic wells, because domestic wells are designed to just be used for drinking and a domestic use. So irrigating up to about a ½ acre of land. So this would be your lawn, your garden. You can water livestock with your domestic well. But once you take that water and you try and grow like a crop, or you want to sell something like, I grew this carrot in my garden and I want to sell this carrot, that's not really an allowable use. So you would need a water right to do that. So I just want people to be really clear that when you see people out and you buy a property, or you're trying to farm, or you want to make a commercial product, there's only a certain things that you can grow or use your domestic well for. And that's really just kind of livestock. Most of the other things, it'd be pretty hard to do on a rural property with kind of the water that's available to you. Now, I will tell you, Oregon is a complaint-driven state. So there are definitely people out there using their domestic wells inappropriately. But OSU Extension, we like to help you get out of that as quickly as you can, or understand that may not be an allowable use. And sometimes people just are not aware. So this is kind of a rough number. Wells have been put in for a really long time, but we haven't necessarily kept track of that for, people coming through Oregon Trail. They had hand dug wells, and we still find some of those old wells out there. They're not in good shape. They probably shouldn't be used. And there's a lot of quite old wells. So we don't have paperwork on everything. So there's a little bit of guessing that goes in here. But what we do know is that if we go look at Oregon Water Resources Board, we have just almost about 9,000 active domestic wells in that system. So these are wells that were drilled, something like a well log was created and sent to our Water Resource Board. So if you've never seen your well log, a little bit later, I'll show you a link where you can go look for yours. One of those things is that, we've had wells for a long time. And when an old well stops working, maybe it's really shallow, it dries up, or like old hand dug wells that were still in service for a while, and as they're breaking down, we don't always take those old wells out of service appropriately. So when I go in and I look at these almost 9,000 wells that we have records for in Benton County, there are very few that are listed as abandoned or properly decommissioned. And so this means we have somebody has gone in and taken the appropriate steps to basically take that straw that we have put into the aquifer and made sure that straw is not there. Because you have to remember that conduit directly into those aquifers. And so when we don't take them out of service correctly, it can be a conduit for any surface contamination. So last time I looked in our Benton County logs, there was a little over 200 to 250 that had been taken out of service. There are a lot more wells out there that probably could be taken out of service, or maybe we just don't even know they're there, because sometimes they get covered over, that kind of thing. And there is no regulation on your private drinking water supply. So when I say there's no regulation, you are responsible for your own water testing program, your well maintenance program, and then if you need water treatment, you're responsible for that too. So nobody sends you the handy reminder in the mail that says, hey, you need to get your water tested. And just because I mentioned that soil a couple times, soil is really important for water, especially water quality, because this is where a lot of kind of great action takes place. So anytime we put something on the surface, or where your drain field is, when you have a septic system, you need to remember that your soil serves a couple purposes. One, the physical filter. It's that blockage between the surface and that first unconfined aquifer. And then there's such a wide variety of organisms that live within the soil that they really provide a lot of kind of breakdown when we're spreading things like fertilizer, compost, using pesticides. Like a lot of these are designed to break down in the soil environment. So they might have like a mode of action. They might be, you know, active to do this certain thing that we've done, but then they kind of break down and break apart. So when we're applying something like compost, that's maybe manure based, we're applying that because we want our plants to take the nitrate out of that so that they can grow as fertilizer. And then there's a lot of chemical reactions. And just keep in mind that in Oregon, a lot of our soils are negatively charged, which is really important when you are thinking about the way some things break down, because everything kind of either has a positive charge, a negative charge, or neutral. And our water's neutral, so it doesn't really help hold anything into the soil. That's why we can have leaching very easily. And it is really important to keep in mind that the most of the soil that does the heavy lifting is about our first 4 feet of soil. Now, in some cases, they could be a little bit deeper, kind of depending upon where you live and the soil type. But just keep in mind that first 4 feet is doing a lot of the action for us when we're really reliant on that to make sure those surface contaminants are not getting into the groundwater. And as Sarah said, if you have questions, throw those in the chat. I do have the chat up so I can see it. And I will answer kind of questions as I see them pop in, or if I know that I'm going to get to it in a little bit, I might just ignore that for a second because I know we're going to get there. But these are the quality concerns that we see from nature. And most of you have either experienced one of these, but these are the ones that some of them that we're not super worried about. Now, things like iron and calcium carbonate, hard water, orange staining, and white staining. When we have these, they're really kind of a pain in the neck, right? Like they can make your water taste funny, like the iron metallic-y flavored. They cause these stainings or buildups in our toilets and our showers. So they're kind of an aesthetic issue. Obviously damage with our plumbing, so some people choose to treat them, but it's not going to be something that's going to cause an issue with your health or your family's health. And then we get to this last one on this list, and it's arsenic. And that one, obviously, we've kind of all heard about. Unfortunately, it's invisible. You can't taste it, you can't smell it. And so I'll get a little bit more into like kind of what we're worried about as far as arsenic in the water. But then we jump over to our harmless bacteria. Now we'll cover bacteria in a few minutes that are harmful and can cause you to get sick. But we have a couple of harmless bacteria that one actually causes the generation of hydrogen sulfide. So that's what that rotten egg smell is. If you turn on your tap water and you get that wonderful smell. I grew up in Lake County. So as a teen, we had exceptionally hard water, very iron rich. And this was out of town, not in town. And everything smelled like rotten eggs. So it was a beautiful combination of water quality issues, but none of it was going to hurt us. And then the other thing is iron bacteria. And this isn't bacteria that we would consider naturally occurring all the time. But it can, if you have it, excuse me, create kind of a slime. If you have it at really light levels, it almost looks like when you pour a glass, like a sheen on the top of the glass that looks like purple or blue. So almost like you haven't rinsed like the soap out of the glass. And so you can dump it out and try again and it's still there. But these iron bacteria are actually pretty easily moved around on like drillers equipment, well contractors, if they've been into your well. So if you don't have it, we're grateful. We don't want it. Always make sure you're asking anybody working on your well to sanitize their equipment because it can move fairly easily between sites. But over time, like it can actually build up like a really heavy slime at the base of your well where the water is being pulled up and actually plug that up and then cause issues with your pump. So if you do have iron bacteria, I'm happy to kind of work with you on creating a treatment plan because it does unfortunately involve a fairly regular treatment of chlorine bleach, so shock chlorination. But not every well is on the same kind of treatment schedule for that. Some people will only have to treat once a year. Some people have to treat once a month. So I would love if you would throw into the chat just for me to see, what do you love or not love about your water? And then I will kind of keep track of that as I go. And if you have purchased your home, pretty much in the last 20, 30 years, there's been some changes to this law. There's something that a lot of people call the real estate transaction law. It's actually got a real formal name, but almost exclusively you'll hear them talk about it like this. And just anytime property changes hands that has a domestic well, there has to be a test done for arsenic, nitrate, and total coliform bacteria. Now, arsenic was not added until the early 2000s to this law, so it used to be nitrate and coliform. It's really important to note that the water just has to be tested. Since there's not a regulation of your domestic well, it doesn't actually have to pass in that property transfer. There's no pass fail. It may say like a fail or a pass on your testing sheet, but those are kind of designations that are set by our Safe Drinking Water Act, and that's a federal act. So that would just say that if you live in a public water system, that they couldn't supply you that water legally. And we know if we've been paying attention the last few years, there's been a lot of public water systems that have had issues with certain things. So like Flint, Michigan, most people have heard about that with the lead in their water. So those systems are regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act. Now, we also look at that when we're giving recommendations based upon health issues with water quality with your domestic well. So the first one of those would be arsenic. I mentioned arsenic was, you can't see, smell, or taste it. So one of those things for you to really look at is if you've never had an arsenic test done, I would really recommend that you kind of work with a private lab, get that arsenic system, get your arsenic tested. You either will have it or you don't. The only time we recommend that you really are retesting for arsenic is if you do something like you're pulling from a different part of the aquifer. So you move your pump up or down, or we have something like an earthquake where the aquifers can actually shift inside. Typically, it's going to stay fairly steady. And I saw a couple folks that mentioned like arsenic filtering systems. And there really isn't a filter for arsenic. There's a couple things you can do. There's an anion exchange system and a reverse osmosis. And it's the same with nitrate. So be very careful about calling it a filter, because sometimes there are treatment systems out there that you can buy that will say they take something out, but unless it's a certified system, there's not all systems are certified. I will just say that. So if you do have a system, we always make sure, like after we put some sort of system on, to retest to make sure it's actually effective. Arsenic should be at 10 parts per billion or less. And that's a little bit different. Arsenic has a very low tolerance in water. It used to actually be up at the 20 parts per billion, but we've changed it. And really, we would prefer, kind of in my world, that you're drinking well water that doesn't have any arsenic in it. I'm trying to get the sun off of me. I really love it though. I'm like very excited for the sun here. But the reason these tolerances are so low is that we're already consuming arsenic in our diet every day. Things that have things like seeds in it. So like an apple juice, something that was processed with the seed in it, that could have a pretty high level of arsenic. Things like rice pretty commonly are known to have arsenic. I prefer my arsenic to be consumed in like red wine. And so I know I definitely don't want to be drinking any of it. But that kind of leads us to nitrate. So nitrate wasn't one of those naturally occurring contaminants. So this is a contaminant that we worry about because it comes from the surface. Almost everything that we do on the land, any form of land use, there's some sort of nitrogen component to it. And nitrate's just that simplest form. So when we're thinking about nitrate, where it might come from, fertilizers, septic systems, livestock. So really any of those things that like the poops, I like to call them the poops for sure. Anything that's like, there's like a human component, wildlife component, anything where we're already got that system kind of going. Now you might notice here, I did include the little nitrate ion. It is negative. And the only thing that uses this in the soil environment is the root systems of plants. So once it gets past that root zone, so for example, if we've gone out and we fertilized our lawn, and then we get an unexpected rain shower that maybe is more rain than we really did expect, it can actually push that fertilizer down, those nitrate ions, past the root zone. And so then there's nothing else that's going to use it, break it down any further. And it's going to, the more rain we get, travel with water, because water is a neutral ion, down into our aquifer. So for me, when I start seeing somebody who has elevated levels of nitrate, that tells me that there's some surface to groundwater interaction happening. But also the reason that we really worry about nitrate is because there are also some health effects that come with drinking water that has nitrate in it. And you saw that nitrate said 10 parts per million is kind of where we worry about. Like if you were, again, in town paying a water bill, they couldn't legally distribute that water. But in Oregon, when one of our public drinking water systems hits about a 5 part per million, DEQ, Oregon Health Authority, all of kind of those regulators that work with public systems, they really try and work with those systems to get them on a plan to reduce that nitrate level down. Because we're aware that nitrate can cause some health issues, especially in our I call them our special population. So children under 2, their diet primarily is water-based, especially like on formula, juices that are watered down, pregnant women, and then really anybody over the age 60, 65, or if they are already have some sort of other health issue. And so like really commonly, folks that have like COPD or asthma, things where oxygen is really important, nitrate can actually interfere with your body's ability to absorb oxygen, carry it around your bloodstream, which isn't the work, isn't as hard on your body when you're a normal, healthy adult with a good blood volume. But again, small children, folks that are already having some sort of medical issue. And then when your hemoglobin breaks down, which is what carries the oxygen, nitrate can actually interfere with, when that breakdown happens, an enzyme is released to tell your body to make more hemoglobin. That enzyme action actually kind of stops, and then your body's not creating as much hemoglobin. So it's just this cycle. And so we really want to stop you from consuming that, or definitely make some decisions if you know that you have nitrate in your water. And again, since it only exists on the surface, then we also wonder about what else could be getting in there. Just because we're in this area, there is actually a groundwater management area. And this area was declared in the early 2000s because there was really high levels of nitrate in about 70% of the wells that were tested. And this is a voluntary action. But if you've been paying attention to the news in the last year or so, you may have already heard about a groundwater management area up in the Umatilla and Morrow County region. They also have really high nitrate levels. And so right up there's definitely a bigger push right now, doing some outreach and education, and also helping people install treatment systems. But we also have one very close to home. So there's a lot of research and outreach and education that's been done in this region for the last couple of years. I would say since probably the late 90s, and even before that, before the groundwater management area was even declared. Looking at this region, if you've been in the area for a while, you're like, wow, there's a lot of agriculture in this area. There's a lot of ag, there's a lot of land use that happens. And, as science changes, cropping systems change, recommendations on how you fertilize crops, how you're harvesting crops. There's a lot of old homesteads, many septic systems in this region, and a lot of them are quite old, and definitely some that are failing. And another thing about our region that's pretty interesting is that we have pretty shallow groundwater. So working in this region specifically, it's not uncommon for me to have someone call and say, I have a well that's 30 feet deep, but their well might be 30 feet deep, but their actually static water level, or where their water is in their well, could be 10 feet. It could be 5 feet. And so they're pulling water from maybe 30 feet to 20 feet up into their well. Just scrolling through. Oh, where does arsenic come from? That is a good question. So arsenic is in our area is primarily from volcanic geology. So it's kind of it's definitely naturally occurring. Now, in some other areas of the state, we do look at it that there is potential in like industrial areas for arsenic, like glass. If there's like a glass industry near you, or a plant, we could see arsenic from there. And then we used to use arsenical pesticides, but those have been outlawed for a really long time. But unfortunately, every now and again, we will find things like, a barrel of some random pesticide in a back room. The farms maybe changed hands, that kind of thing. So if you ever find something on your property that's that you think could be a pesticide, you don't know what it is, I would reach out to the SWCD, OSU Extension. We can help connect you with maybe a pesticide collection event, because we do want to dispose of those in a different manner. But sometimes people would dispose of those by simply digging a hole and burying those. And unfortunately, that's not the right way to do that. And I do not recommend any water testing labs, because we don't do that as a recommendation. However, we have a list of labs from Oregon Health Authority. If you live in Benton County, you are lucky enough to have Edge Analytical that's located on the HP campus. The next closest one would be Water Lab in Salem. And then if you are down closer to Eugene, there's an analytical lab down there as well. And I would reach out to them. Each lab has their own kind of package. There's always going to be a real estate package because of that requirement with property changing hands, but you can ask for a nitrate test, an arsenic test, a coliform bacteria test. In both Benton, Lynn, Lane, Marion, and Polk counties, because of my programming, we do offer free nitrate screenings, both at community events or anytime our offices are open. You can bring a half a cup of untreated water in a clean container. It takes about 10 minutes. And we can give you a pretty good idea of what your nitrate level is, but we don't test for anything else in our office. So for nitrate, 10 parts per million is that Safe Drinking Water Act. We like to really talk to people about proactive monitoring and potentially treatment when they're in that 4 to 7 range is where we're going to start talking about being more proactive about monitoring. When you hit 7, it depends a little bit on your household, but we want to make sure you have all the information. Yeah, our Joe's asking the hard questions. Our nitrate problem in the Southern Willamette Valley groundwater management area, from the latest numbers I've seen, we are on average are less nitrate, but still kind of over that 10 parts per million on average. Where Umatilla, there are regular wells that test regularly, both monitoring and domestic, between 20 and even up to 100 parts per million, just in some of the data that I've seen recently. So they definitely have much more than we do at this moment in time. So hopefully there can be some resolution. And I don't work up there as much. My program is very regional. I am the only OSU extension person in the state that really works with domestic wells and septics on a regular basis. And it's all funded by the county commissioners in each county. So they pay for about 10 to 20% of my time. So I can work with amazing partners and answer questions, because like I said, every well is a little bit different. So everybody kind of has different needs from me. So nitrate screenings, we recommend you test it about once a year. This doesn't have to be, like I said, a lab test. You could do it at one of our community clinics. And we do a lot in the summer. So if you call our office or you shoot me an email, I can tell you when the next one is coming up. And then You should always keep records. Like anytime you get your water tested, it's really important to kind of throw those in. If electronic folder works for you, an actual paper folder. I'm old enough that paper folders are my comfort zone, so I really like those. But it's important if you keep those records that you can kind of look back at the history of your water quality, because sometimes things like nitrate can sneak up on you. So maybe it was 2 parts per million for a couple of years, and then it was 3, and then you get a 4. And then you're like, whoa, hold up. And then you start like looking back and you can kind of see, is there a seasonality to it? Sometimes for some wells, nitrate steady all year round. For other wells, there might be no nitrate all summer long when it's drier and we don't have water moving through the soil profile. But then you come to the rainy season and it immediately spikes up in October after we've had a good couple heavy rains. So again, everything's a little bit different. So kind of screening frequently and keeping those results is really important. So arsenic and nitrate, because these are 2 that cause health issues, we do start talking about treatment kind of in this situation. If you have iron, calcium carbonate, any of those aesthetic ones that I talked about, I can absolutely shoot you in the right direction to look for the kinds of treatment that will take those out. But because these ones cause health issues, we definitely want to talk about the appropriate treatment. There are 3 that work. Most commonly, people will use reverse osmosis because this one seems to be the most effective, but it's very expensive. We have kind of listed here the initial cost, and that's a range, of course, and then the maintenance. And so something like an anion exchange system, these are only available in what we call like point of entry or whole home system. So you're treating all the water that's coming into the house. Whereas reverse osmosis, you could get a whole home system, or you can get something called a point of use system. So this is like installed under your sink, and you actually have like a secondary little faucet. And so you're just used drinking and cooking out of that. We don't necessarily worry about, unless you have really, really high levels of arsenic, treating something like the water you brush your teeth with. And these are not absorbed through the skin. So we don't worry about, washing clothes, showering, that kind of thing. And Susan had a great question of, do we need to test for nitrate, even if you're not applying anything to your property? If you live on a rural property and you have a septic system, that can be a source of nitrate, because both your urine and your feces can contain a nitrate component to it, or a nitrogen component. And sometimes if you see an elevated level of nitrate, this can be your first kind of clue that your septic system may need to be pumped, or there might be something else going on with it. Additionally, even if you are not applying anything, you cannot control what's happening on your neighbors' properties, right? You don't know necessarily what's going on. The other thing about nitrate is because we all are inputting little pieces into it, and groundwater, I mentioned, flowed at the beginning. If something is, we have a large nitrate source, maybe a couple miles from you, and it could take a really long time to get to you, like years and years, as slow as groundwater flows. Once it's in the groundwater, it is not going to come back out of the groundwater until it is pumped out and goes back through the water cycle. So it's just important to kind of keep track. And again, because it's that surface to groundwater contamination, if you start to see like even a little bit of nitrate and you haven't had it before, it could tell you that maybe you need to make sure you're testing again for coliform bacteria, because coliform bacteria only exists on the surface. Reverse osmosis will help with the hydrogen sulfide, the question from the chat, but typically an aerator will work. Hydrogen sulfide is one of those tricky ones, because honestly, if you just like for drinking and cooking, if you let, you just, put that water in a pitcher, put it in the refrigerator, it's going to dissipate off pretty rapidly. But if you want to kind of really treat it before it gets in the house, it's kind of more of an aeration type system. A lot of the other ones will help, but hydrogen sulfide could be treated for much less money than something like a reverse osmosis system or an anion exchange system. The third one on here is a distillation system. We do not recommend these distillation systems, but people sometimes still have them. And so for short-term use, this would be a system that you could use, but it is really expensive to use. It also takes all of the minerality out of your water. It takes everything out. And so your body can actually start giving up minerals because you do get micronutrients from the water that you drink. And it also will taste really flat. It doesn't have any carbonation to it. And well water, you know, there is like a little bit of like kind of oxygen. So when you get like through your aeration devices, that kind of thing, distillers will not provide that. So it'll taste, just doesn't taste good because it doesn't have a taste. And I always say like water doesn't taste, right? But like everybody's water has a little bit different flavor to it. This distilled water is not going to satisfy anybody's needs. And then kind of the third thing we talk about is coliform. Coliform you should be testing for every 1 to 3 years. So this, if you wanted to do a lab test, you're like, I don't want to worry about extension, I just want to go to the lab. You could do coliform and nitrate kind of the same time. This is a really big group of bacteria. Almost all of them are not harmful. However, there are a couple. And these are the fecal coliforms. So these would be the ones definitely from your septic system, or if there is some source around you, like a manure pile, right? Sometimes we'll keep our manure, we might have piled it up kind of over the winter because we want to use it like in our garden. We want to spread it on a pasture, but it needs to be covered so that water's not leaching through it, because that coliform, just like nitrate, can move through the soil a little bit. Obviously the soil's got those microorganisms that can help battle this, but sometimes we just get a lot of water moving through really fast, and you can't rely on the soil 100% of the time to break this down, or if there's some sort of direct contamination source. You know, it's hard, especially in something like, you know, January, February, on those years that it's been really, really wet, and it feels like the water table's ankle deep. You can't really rely on the soil to be doing a lot of that breakdown for you in treatment. So this coliform bacteria every 1 to 3 years, if we find coliform in there, whether it is there's 2 tests they do. The first test they do is if coliform is absent or present. And if it is present, then they move on to see if it's a fecal coliform. Now, even if you get a positive coliform test, but they say it's not fecal coliform, you still shouldn't be drinking the water until you've tried to figure out why that coliform's there and done some treating, because you're only bringing in like 4 ounces of water. So just because that 4 ounces you brought didn't have a fecal coliform in it, it doesn't mean, since there's surface to groundwater interaction being proven by that coliform being positive, that you wouldn't have it in another, you know, couple days or just a different time that you turn on your faucet. And I will provide this too. I know we're recording it, but I'll provide the PowerPoint with some notes on it so that you can have this to refer back to, because I wouldn't want to listen to my voice again for another hour to be like, oh, look, that kind of thing. So you can scroll through the slides a little faster. Now, most people, you know, there's the find out why you have coliform, fix it, and then disinfect. A lot of times when you get this positive test back, you don't know, like, there's nothing that's going to come to your mind right away of like, oh my gosh, this is what happened. You're like, ooh, I really don't know. Like, there's no, you know, it hasn't been really wet outside. Nobody's been working on the well. We haven't had like anybody work on the pump, anything like that. So sometimes folks will jump right to that treatment stage. And treatment in this situation would be shock chlorination. And we have resources on our website on how to figure out how much chlorine bleach that you would use for a shock chlorination treatment with your well. But if you're not comfortable doing that yourself, really call a licensed well contractor to come out. If you are comfortable doing it yourself and you're really good at following directions, there's some great YouTube videos out there to watch. Always find one that's from an extension service, or EPA's got a good one. Somebody who's pretty reputable. This is not the time that you want to find the YouTube video of like somebody with maybe just does fun videos. Make sure it's a reputable source. Now, sometimes in an emergency situation, because you might get that result on a Friday afternoon. I always feel like that's when people call me. It's like Friday at 4:30 and they're like, I just got this test result back. You might need to use our boil and bleach method. So you're boiling your water for 1 minute, you're adding liquid chlorine bleach. If you do this, know that since you're on a well, this is going to smell very, very bleachy to you. So if you have something like a carbon filter, pitcher, this kind of thing, you can run the water back through that to help take that smell out. Now, longer term, sometimes we have people that get a positive test, they shock, they look around everything on their property, they're trying to figure out where it's coming from, and sometimes we can never figure it out. And in that situation, we would recommend treatment. There are 2 effective treatment types that we recommend. There are other ones out there, but these are really tried and true. One is a constant chlorinator. Again, I recommend following it with a carbon filter because you have a great well, that if you've been on a well water for a long time, you do not like the smell of that chlorine bleach. And then UV or ultraviolet light. So the water passes by this light and it actually kills the bacteria. And so you don't have to worry about it making you sick. Ultraviolet does require you to change that light on a kind of a regular basis. There's always maintenance manuals, and it's important to still be doing things like testing every 1 to 3 years, because sometimes those routine tests that we do are going to clue you in that maybe it's time to change your UV light, because we don't, be honest, like we aren't out every day looking at our wellhead. We're not looking at our water treatment system. And sometimes these things go out, like they go out faster than they're supposed to go out, right? Like, I don't know about you, but you get like an LED light bulb and it says, this lasts for 10 years. And 3 years later, you turn on the light and it burns out. And you're like, but where's my 7 more years? So it's very similar in this situation, is that you want to be checking it all the time. So sometimes bacteria in our well water, there's a couple of things we kind of go to first. One of the things is just the type of well. So like I mentioned, we have hand dug wells that are still out there. Drilled wells are the kind of wells that are put in right now. They're drilled down. There's a grout seal that's put on them. But there's still things like driven wells, where basically a pipe was sharpened and kind of drilled down into the ground, and it doesn't always have a grout seal. So not all wells were constructed the same. And the older the well is on your property, the more likely that it doesn't meet our current construction standards, because those have changed over time. And they can break down with age. So your casing under the ground, that soil that does such good work for us of breaking down like manure and all that biological degradation, can also degrade the outside of your casing. I meant the quality of construction on here, and that's just that not, just like anything that's built, not everything is always built the exact same way. We have construction standards, but that doesn't mean that sometimes, the driller's having a bad day or there's somebody new on the job. So occasionally we do see issues about quality of construction. I will say Oregon Water Resources Board is really quick if they see a well putting in or shoddy work through their licensed well contractors that they're maintaining that license. They're quick to pull those licenses and really encourage them to go back for training. I also mentioned depth. So if you have a 150-foot well, you are less likely to have surface to groundwater interaction than someone who has got a 35-foot well. And that's, just kind of that reality of having almost the extra 100 feet of soil, bedrock, heavy clay layers in there to kind of protect you. And then close to a contamination source. So that Southern Willamette Valley groundwater management area, there are a couple of areas where we have houses that the houses themselves are very close to a dairy. Some of the houses are not even permitted to be houses, but because they are so close to that dairy, even though the dairy's following all of the rules and they have a plan of how they spread manure and how they handle manure, the groundwater is still really shallow. And again, things happen. And so sometimes you spread your manure because that is how you tip some of it, how you deal with some of that manure. But then we get those freak rainstorms in, and so it might push more down. So you're just closer to a large volume. So just keep that in mind. Also, something like your septic system. Wells and septic should be a certain amount of distance apart. But when we're looking at especially smaller rural properties that maybe are only a couple of acres each, it's not uncommon sometimes to see a well that has been put in and a septic system drain field is within 5 to 10 feet. There have been times where, I've been in an area and I've seen a well and I'm like, that's weird because the septic is right here. And as I'm looking at where the drain field is, like the well is in the middle of a septic field. So these things happen and they shouldn't happen, right? Like, and obviously when you're having to replace either a septic or a well, like current construction standards happen. But we do see this. Every day we're trying to reduce the number of these incidences that happen. So I really want you to take a look at your well a couple times a year and give it a little inspection, right? So the 2 times would be about this time of year where we're taking it out of our kind of the winter mode that it could be in and, kind of freeing it for the summer almost. And we're looking for that there's not any surface water at the base. You don't see any visible cracks. The cap looks secure. There should be a vent pipe on it that lets a little bit of air into the system because obviously that pump turns on. There's a pressure tank. You could create a vacuum if that little bit of air is not allowed in. But sometimes those vent pipes are not screened and they're big enough in some situations for something like a mouse to get in, a rat. Like we've seen them get in very, very tiny spaces and certainly insects. So these are the 2 most common types of wellheads. If you have a wellhead that is different from this, I do encourage you to send me a picture of it and I can kind of draw arrows on it and say, I think this is what this is and this is what this is, so that you know what you're kind of looking for. Because again, these are the most current kind of wellheads that are put in. These have been put in for a while. We have a lot of old systems out there. And so I really like to help people figure out what is their personal system, should they be looking for. And then I would say you want to go and you want to winterize your well. So if we're doing this here in kind of May and June, as we start getting into the fall season, October, November, that's the time to go out and make sure that how are you going to protect this wellhead or any pieces of your well system for things like freezing. It doesn't freeze here like a hard freeze for like multiple days very often, but it sometimes does. So you can go out and install the heat tape around the pipes. You don't have to plug it in. It's just ready to go. If you get that kind of alert that pops up on your phone, you're watching the news, that we're going to get that kind of freezing weather, you can go out and plug it in. But it's also a good time just to inspect all the parts. Coliform testing was every 1 to 3 years. Question in the chat. So casing now.
Sorry to interrupt. There's another question in the chat too.
Almost there. Almost there.
You're getting to that.
And I'm not ignoring you, Kate. I promise I will answer your question. So the casing height should be 1 foot about above the surface of the ground. Now, if you have a well that's in a pit, so we used to actually put them in almost in a little pit in the ground or right at the ground surface, just the next time that you need to get your well serviced or like your pump goes out and you need to replace it, this is the time that you can actually pay to get them to extend this casing height up to minimum is 1 foot. You don't want them too much taller than that, but the primary purpose of this is to help us not lose wells, because when they were in a pit or when they're at ground level, it's really easy to get it covered over with dirt, especially like, you got construction, other things are going on in your property, properties change hands. So we're trying to not lose our wells. And also things like not running your wellhead over. So your wellhead should have some form of protection around it. It does not have to be a well house, but something that reminds you that it's there, because I have had people call me and they say, hey, what happens if you back into your wellhead and it's sideways, like leaning? What should I do? that's an expensive mistake to make. And sometimes, depending upon exactly how hard you hit it, there's definitely some financial repercussions to that. So always know where your wellhead is. I mentioned that grout seal. So when a well is drilled, they actually put a grout seal around it. So think of this as like heavy clay, cement, that kind of thing, and it's really packed around that casing. Minimum of 18 feet down. That's current construction standards. Many go much deeper than that, and that is so that when water is moving across the surface of the ground, say like we get a heavy rain, there's a lot of water moving across the surface, it can't get to your well and then go down that outside of your well right into the aquifer. It's like a little conduit right there. So that's what that grout seal is meant to stop. And it also really holds it steady. So, you know, think our soils, as we go through the wet and dry seasons, our soils will expand with the water. And then as they dry, we'll see them shrink back up. This sealant is designed to hold that steady and to not, it doesn't flex. It doesn't have as much like expansion and contraction that happens. So I mentioned your well log. If you have a well log, you can go to this website, and a couple ways that I recommend people search for this. This is an amazing one page of information if you have one. Also, don't be upset if you can't find yours. Like I mentioned before, there are wells out there that don't have these, but we know there's a domestic well at that house because like there's a house there and people live there, but we don't have we know there's a water source. We're going to assume almost always that it's a domestic well, especially on a rural property. But this gives you a lot of information. When you go to search, put in your tax lot number. And the reason why I say this is that your tax lot doesn't typically change. Whereas this is a local well log that was pulled. If you go in and search by the address, unfortunately on this one, if you don't have those dots in there between the N and the E, it's not going to show up because there's not a standardized way that was actually put in always. Now, some of those have been remedied. You could search by the name of the driller. Now, I don't know about you, but I would have a really hard time remembering somebody that was out at my property for 1 or 2 days in 1993. If it wasn't like a piece of paper in like my well file, I would probably struggle. So if you have a great memory, but also remember that when property changes hands, this name is not going to change. This Jade Peterson is not going to change in their system. It's going to still say the name of the person who had the well drilled. So tax lot number is the best. But on here, this gives you, you can see how they drilled it. You can see kind of right here in the middle of the page that they drilled this well. It was a 10-inch diameter is what it started at. Their final went down to a 6-inch diameter, and like that's the casing size. And these are the feet, and that they put the grout seal, which they use cement with the bentonite clay mixed in. They used 17 sacks, and that grout seal went from 0 to 34 feet. Now, that's important because I just mentioned the minimum is 18. So like this is double of the grout seal. It also tells you where's your kind of the zone that your water is being pulled into the well from. So on this one, they have their perforations, or that area that's allowing water to go into your well casing, from 116 feet to 156 feet. And then it also tells you all of the layers of soil and rock, all the geology that they went through. And they're very detailed. So you can see here that there's like a clay broken basalt, and then they were in a dark gray basalt that was broken, and then another dark gray basalt that wasn't broken, and then a basalt that had calcite. Then they went back to the regular basalt, and then one with water. So they're very detailed as they go through. And, you know, and some people would be like, well, why did they like be so detailed with the different types? Well, that's so you can kind of help determine like, what were the layers that they went through? Are you in an unconfined aquifer? Are you in a confined aquifer? And so this one, they're for sure in more of a confined aquifer. So just a couple of kind of wellhead protection tips. I want you to find your wellheads. I'm sure since most of you have had your wells for a long time, you know where they are. But I want you to inspect it on a regular basis, twice a year. You could do it more if you want. This really helps you if you're looking at like the sanitary seals. Those are like, almost look like washer material, kind of normally black. When those starts getting like really dry, crusty, it's really time to call the well contractor and to have those replaced. Wellhead work is not a DIY situation. I really don't recommend that you're kind of handling any of those parts and pieces unless you have training in that area, because it's really, really easy to unfortunately have something fall into your well, and then that can cause a whole nother set of issues. Protecting it, so I mentioned like driving over it, but there's other things that happen, right? So we want, you know, I don't know how many times like you might be driving along the road and you see a pasture, maybe there's horses in the pasture. Well, you know that those horses are going to be right as close to that wellhead as they can, and that's where they're going to decide that they want to go poop all the time. And any livestock, you don't want things rubbing up against it, that kind of thing. So even a simple fence around it can be ideal. If you have a well house, that well house is not designed for anything in there that you wouldn't want to drink or consume in your water. So it's not where we store fertilizers. It's not where we store pesticides, paint thinners, fuels, anything like that. Shovels are a good thing to store in your well house. Nothing that's going to kill you, nothing with that little symbol that says if something happens, you have to call poison control. Well houses are really just meant to protect that wellhead and any parts and pieces of your well system. And don't be too attached to your well house, because if any work needs to be done on your well, if it doesn't have a flip top roof or easily movable up and off of your kind of well region, most likely it's going to have some damage that's sustained, especially if they're having to pull pieces of casing or put something like an inner liner in. Because once your casing goes bad, you can get something called an inner liner where they'll drop that in, and it's kind of a one-time rehab for your well. We just talked about the well log. If you have a well log, you find it, great. There should be like a little metal tag. If there's a number on that, you can put that into search there too. That means your well is registered with the state. If you don't have that, you can actually request one through Oregon Water Resources Department, and they are just trying to figure out where all of the domestic wells are. And this is primarily used for emergency situations. I mean, obviously you want to know where they are, but like in an emergency, how can they get a hold of you to tell you, you know, something has happened? And if you've been around for a while, pandemic time is really weird for me because I feel like it's been 3 years ago since it happened, but it is not. It's been much longer. On Highway 99, going north from Corvallis, they had a diesel truck that overturned that dumped a massive amount of diesel. And in that process, they were trying to track where the diesel, if it had gone into the groundwater. Luckily, there's not too many people that lived where the groundwater kind of flowed in that region, but there were people above it that they were actually Water Resources Department contacted, some other organizations contacted. They were able to do well testing very quickly on some of those domestic wells to see if the diesel had gotten into their groundwater source. And then just anytime you're working on your property, if you have questions about, you know, you want to like create something like a compost bin, but you want that compost bin to be covered, you know, really reach out to your Soil and Water Conservation District. That's what they're there for. They can help you with a lot of land use kind of activities and suggestions on ways to manage like the manure on your property, or to help if you have like water that runs through your property. Because sometimes these are, they're inconvenient for us, but they're also ways that contamination could be getting into your groundwater. And then cover those manure piles. We are typically storing that manure so that we can use it for great things later in the year. But during the rainy season, as simple as a tarp over the top is going to prevent that nitrate from leaching out. And then we won't have to worry about seeing it in our groundwater. But also keep in mind that things like manure piles, you know, if there's a lot of rain, that can actually get into the surface water. It doesn't seem like it's a whole lot as it's running across your property. just might seem like a little mild trickle. But this is also the kind of stuff that can get into our little streams on our property, and that's also no good either. And we can see that coliform bacteria when we're doing water testing. And we can also see that coming from septic systems that are starting to malfunction. Sometimes the first sign might actually be with the surface water in your area and not necessarily your groundwater yet. So just another thing to keep track of, or just kind of double check on your property. If you have like your property's pretty old, houses are, there are old houses on there. Sometimes those old houses, livestock barns, had a well that it was associated with them. So just, keep in mind as you're walking through your property, if you see something like this cut off pipe, that's an old well. And these are one of those that were not taken out of service correctly. And this is a direct conduit down into those aquifers. Old windmills are a good sign that you might have had a well, especially a hand dug well. And then this other photo, sometimes we'll see like you're digging, you might see boards or rocks, like you're digging, you're doing something, or you're like, if that's a weird place for this pile of rocks to be. Well, sometimes those pile of rocks were actually a hand dug well, and they were lined with rocks. And as that well is caved in, it looks like there's a rock, like a bunch of rocks in depression, but there could be still an open part of that well. So we want to try and figure out how to get that completely filled in and not have someone walk across it and then fall in. And people do fall in old wells and septic systems more regularly than we would like to admit. After the 2020 wildfires, at least 3 people up the Santiam Canyon fell into their septic systems as they were walking through their property, surveying the damage. And that really that's like the icing on top, right? Like your house is just burned down, you're just going up there to see what's going on, and you fall in your septic tank. And we had another woman in Scotts Mills actually fell into a hand dug well that had been covered over with plywood. The fire kind of been in that region. The wood was weakened, had some soil on top of it too, and she fell into that well. So we don't want those to happen. Oh, old logging operations. Yeah, if funny tree growth, there could be. It might be something, if you're interested in like a pesticide type of testing, there is something called, in a situation where you really have something suspect going on, or you're like, there is something weird. There is something called a peace of mind test. And most of the labs offer it. Is a little bit more expensive for sure, but they test for like the top 50 breakdown components of the most commonly used pesticides. And sometimes if you're curious about something, you can have a conversation, and especially with the lab, and say, this was the industry, it was in this region, I have these concerns, and they can help you kind of pinpoint what to test, because this type of testing, pesticide testing especially, unless you know what you're looking for, can be pretty expensive. So decommissioning an old well, that would be Oregon Water Resources is where you would start. And you would technically want to go and fill out the paperwork to abandon your well. It can be pretty expensive to do this. So abandoning your well means you're temporarily taking out of service. It also kind of allows you to have the time to be able to find a contractor, and also budget in the cost of taking that well out of service with a formal decommissioning. Because the decommissioning process means that they have to, like a standard drill blow we have now, they basically have to perforate that casing all the way down. And then they pack it with like that bentonite clay. So they're stopping it from becoming from being that straw into the ground, down into the aquifer. So it can be pretty expensive. And for really any well maintenance, I really recommend that you and septic pay yourself a water and sewer bill every month. Like, I know that's one of the joys of being on a rural property, but it's also the heartache when one of those systems goes down, that they're not typically inexpensive to fix. If you live in town and your water line breaks out at the street, you can call whoever you pay that bill to, and they have to come fix it. It may be inconvenient, but when that happens on your property, you're responsible for the bill. If you have a property that was built before 2010, you may not have a backflow device on your well. And so these are really crucial, these anti-backflow devices for your outside use especially. So anything you would use to water livestock or drip irrigation, if you're mixing pesticides, that kind of a thing. And this basically, what happens is if you're doing something and the power goes out, because there's a pressurized system, we can actually have a vacuum created. You can siphon whatever you've got that hose in, especially if the hose is under the water, like in a livestock water trough, you can suck that water back up into your system. And sometimes, you know, whatever you're mixing, irrigating, that kind of thing, you don't want everything being sucked back up into the system, especially because then it could be redistributed. Every system's a little different. So this is an example of a well that was in service at one point in time. You can still see the electrical. You can see that this well is in a pit. There are some other issues with this well. The biggest one being it doesn't actually have a well cap on it. So this is open to anything that wanders through can fall into this well. And this is a big enough hole that if something pretty substantial can get in there, and it's a one-way trip down. So if you have a well that looks like this, or is open at all, please reach out to me. I'd love to help you kind of figure out what is the next step to take. Well work, there's not like a lot of grant funds out there to help with that. But sometimes there are things that we can access in some of our housing repair programs, because like this kind of thing is not just a safety issue for your family, it's also a safety issue for our aquifers. So that sometimes we can help when folks are applying for things to be like, oh yeah, that's an absolute a health issue. We're not going to fill out the paperwork for you, but I'm always happy to be like, oh yeah, that's a substantial health risk, or find someone that's regulatory that might also say that. But I don't like to point folks into a regulatory direction unless we're in that funding phase of where they're already basically said, yes, we just need someone to say, yes, absolutely. And they won't let me do it. But that is on very, very rare occasion. Most of our local housing programs, I've worked with enough that if you have a well that looks like this, we can figure it out. All right, so you find you fix all your problems, you still have issues. This is where I spend a lot of time with individuals, considering your options, walking you through, asking all the hard questions. Like, you know, there can be a lot of hard questions because these systems, again, are really, really expensive. Treatment, you have to match your treatment to your water, and you have maybe primary goals of like, my first goal is to make sure the water is not going to be causing a health risk to my family. But secondarily, maybe I have hydrogen sulfide or iron. So every well is a little bit different, and we kind of have all those questions. And so I like to talk you through it and really help you understand like short-term, long-term costs. Definitely there are people, they're like, I'm just going to drill a new well. They have nitrate. I'm just going to drill a new well. I'm like, oh, okay, but like, let's talk through everything. And they drill a new well, and then they find out it's deeper. They have arsenic. It's the same treatment system, and they've now expended money on a whole new well. And maybe they needed that. Maybe they didn't have enough water before. So we really try to help you figure out how do you match the treatment to your needs. And, you know, sometimes treatment, you can get just a simple point of view system, and it's enough for like the 2 or 3 people in your household. But if you have a larger household, sometimes those point of view systems, the smaller ones, they can't keep up with the amount of water you need. So again, this is where I can really kind of help you on an individual basis. If you can't find your well log on the website, and you have 2 wells, 2 tax lot, one is listed, the other is not. The other one probably does not have a well log. Or you can email the water master. I would not say this time of year is a good time to reach out, maybe into the later fall, or submit a well identification application for the well that does not have one. And if they'll look in the back of their system, they have more access than you and I would have in that front facing system to see if there's one actually there. You shouldn't have mold in your pipes. And there's no, if you do, we should talk about it. And I don't recommend you shock chlorinate unless you have a positive test for coliform bacteria, or you are testing for iron, or you're treating for iron bacteria, because shock chlorination can damage the parts and pieces of your system. There's no maintenance of like, you're going to shock it once a year. And I know people that do that. If you have arsenic, it actually can precipitate the arsenic out and elevate the level of arsenic for a couple of months. So there's no like standard treatment for that. If you do have mold in your pipes, we should probably figure out what's going on with your plumbing system, because that's not normal, unless it's maybe just a growth. All right. Yeah. Google is our best friend and our worst enemy. So and this is why I get to answer a lot of questions, because Google is great for some things, and for others, unfortunately, there is a lot of misinformation out there. So I'm going to jump over to septics, and I do want to tell you that I will stay on as long as possible at the very end for Q&A. So don't freak out if you haven't gotten your question answered. And Sarah's like, you can't keep me on here all night, but I will stay on as long as needed. So septic systems are really that out of sight, out of mind, right? Another system we can't see. They all have about the same general parts. They have their tank, their drain field. We are really reliant on the soil in this treatment system. The majority of the treatment happens in the tank itself, the breakdown. But then we are putting that effluent out into a drain field. When it gets to the drain field, that drain field is reliant a lot on evaporation goes up, but also we definitely see it go down. And then gets back into our groundwater and goes back through the cycle, which a lot of people don't like to think about. These are types of septic tanks. I will tell you right now that the most common tank put in is a cement or a concrete tank. It may have one port. This one has 3. It has 2 inspection ports and a pumping port. Yours might just have 1, and that's okay too. These polyvinyl type tanks have been more common. If you've been to any big box store recently, you could see these out in the parking lot where they store their extra stuff. Some counties are going away from allowing these tanks because they've become more headache than they were worth. So if you have gotten just a recent system installed, you could have one of these tanks. We would recommend that you definitely are doing more regular inspections of it. These are not, and we have seen, the car is a little bit of a joke, but we have seen one of those be pulled out in that groundwater management area. But more commonly, remember that some of our homes were built before there was a lot of indoor plumbing. So those 55-gallon drums were kind of all the rage when we started adding indoor plumbing, daisy chained together, and they're pretty effective. But if we have those systems now, we want to get them changed. So here's those distance requirements. Now, if you have a system, these systems on your property right now, they are grandfathered into whatever was the current construction standard when they were put in. If you have to replace or one of these systems fails, then you will have to meet the current requirements. So from a wellhead to your tank, minimum of 50 feet. And these are minimums. It definitely could be much bigger. And I, of course, would prefer them as far away as you can get them. And then your wellhead to your drain field, 100 feet. Your wellhead is one of those things that we talk about. It would be ideal if we could take your wellhead and we could basically go out 100 feet and then draw a circle around it and say nothing that could possibly contaminate it could be within this 100 feet. That's not very probable, especially the smaller of a property that it is. But that is just ideal, is that you're keeping livestock 100 feet away. And again, minimum requirements. One thing I didn't mention, I'll go back real quick, is this replacement area. If you currently have a septic system and a drain field, I would like you to think about where you would put a replacement drain field. If this drain field fails, and they do wear out over time, you will, the cheaper option is to put in a new drain field. Like the tank can be lifted out of that spot and replaced in that exact same spot. But the drain field, if you can put it in a new area, you're going to save yourself minimum $10,000. If you have to put a new drain field in over an old drain field, then you get to pay for some really fancy engineering. And the more engineering you have to put in, and the more advanced system you have to put in, the higher the cost. And sometimes that does just happen because like there's no other place in your property to put it. So this is what a tank will look like if we were to just like kind of cut it open from the side. And this is a maintained tank. So this is what I want everybody's, this is my hopes and dreams. What I dream about at night is everybody's tank looks like this. This is also a 2-chamber tank. They also come in 1 chambers too. So if you have a 1-chamber tank, just know that these 2-chamber tanks are more popular, and there's a little bit of a reason for that. So as any waste comes into your tank, think of this a little bit as an extension of your stomach. So there's a continued digestion that happens, a continued breakdown, right? But most of the stuff that goes down our drains, there's a lot of liquid component to that. We, use clean water in our toilets before we use them and make that water dirty. So that cloudy liquid effluent is really, it's primarily what will go out into the environment. This is what's going to be pushed out into your drain field. The sludge layer, this is made up of kind of jokingly the fiber of your diet, the stuff that can't break down anymore. Soil. So as we're doing laundry, washing our hands, we're washing dirt off. This is where those soil particles are going to go. And then just because it is a breakdown process, we are going to have a layer of scum and a gas layer that's created during that kind of breakdown process. With 2-chamber tanks, when you flush the toilet, it comes through that first baffle, but then it's going to push an equal amount of effluent in through this middle baffle into our 2nd chamber, where that breakdown digestion process continues to happen. And then also we're going to get that same amount of effluent is going to be pushed out into your drain field. Now, the reason we've gone to 2-chamber tanks is because you see in that first chamber, the sludge is actually built up higher than it has in the 2nd chamber. When we have 1-chamber tanks, as that sludge builds up, it's almost a little bit more equal. And so if we don't maintain our tank in that 1-chamber tank, the sludge can actually be pushed out into our drain field about the same time we're having backup issues in the house. So with the 2-chamber tank, typically the sludge builds up more in the 1st chamber. We're having issues in the house. You flush the toilet, effluent, gross stuff comes up in the shower, that kind of thing. So it's almost to kind of say, hey, it's time, you should be getting your septic tanks pumped, because the higher the sludge layer gets, the less effective that effluent breakdown is. Like there's less room in your tank to hold all the liquid that's coming in, all the waste that's coming in, and then having an appropriate breakdown time. So this is what your tank looks like if you don't ever get it pumped, or you don't do it on a routine schedule. And this sludge will start to, like the first few years, depending upon how often you have to pump, will be pretty thin, but then it actually accumulates faster as we have less and less time for breakdown to happen. So tree run, I'll jump back to that tree roots around the well. We don't worry about the tree roots too much unless it's a very water loving tree. Ideally, your well is not actually under a tree, because you need to remember the roots can penetrate that casing. So I would not plant trees near there. If you have something like a willow or an aspen, that is, you're kind of looking for trouble. So those really water loving roots, and you'll see in a little bit what roots can look like and how much damage they can do pretty quickly. This is a sand filter system. So this is dependent upon your soil type. So when I start talking about the more fancier systems, so if your soil is not conducive to just accepting the effluent and moving through a traditional system, because there is a soil percolation test that's done. When you get that done, if your soil will not kind of function the way the county would like it to function, you may have to put in something called a sand filter system. And this is just kind of a generic version where you still have the septic tank, but you also will have a secondary tank that's going to control the amount of effluent that goes out into the what we would then refer to as the drain field. But it's kind of that sand filter area. So it'll go up to the top of the sand. It'll penetrate down. It goes back typically back to that pump tank in kind of a secondary way, and then it's actually pumped out into your drain field. So it has more of that like time in the treatment and the sand and that for breakdown. If you're jumping back to your wells, well pump. So that it is a mystery, those pump systems. It does not have backup power. So if you are new to your rural property, if the power goes out, your well no longer works. Now, some people will, there's a little bit of residual water kind of in your system that you could probably get out. But it's very common when it's get to be the stormy season where we anticipate, oh no, it's getting windy, that people will like fill up their bathtubs so they can flush their toilet. And you should have some backup water storage for drinking and cooking. Because that is one of those joys of rural living. There's not a backup kind of system. This is not a drain field or an alternative drain field. And when I moved to the Willamette Valley 20 some years ago, and Joe's got her hands, I see her hands gone up. I love that. This was not uncommon to see if people were floating the Willamette River. I will not get in the Willamette River, and it's much cleaner now than it was then. But this was not uncommon to see. So this is not what we want to see for a drain field. If you have any issues with your septic system, or you think that you are going to need to get a new septic system, you need to get repair. There are so many programs right now to help you at various stages to pay for inspections and repairs. This does not mean we're going to pay for pumping, but there's some programs out there through some of our partners through Craft 3 that have some state funds for replacement and repair of septic systems that are failing. And some of those are grant programs and some are loan programs. So here's a picture of a drain field. And you can see on this drain field, there are 3 lines. There is a 4th line, but it's not currently accepting effluent. And this is just because the system is gravity fed. So if you have to pump your effluent uphill, the idea is it's equally distributed on your drain lines. But this one is gravity. The system is up top. So when it gets to that distribution box, the first 3 lines are getting it. The 4th line is not. So this is actually a system that's functioning great. You can see that there definitely is some evaporation, some effluent moving up, and it's providing a little more moisture and probably some nitrate. So that grass is growing really well and it's nice and green. So if you have a septic system and you don't know where it is, stop irrigating too much in the area you think it is. And sometimes we can see these in the drier season. And you don't need to irrigate this area. I understand like a little bit to maybe like keep everything more of an equal green, but you don't need to add more water to a system that is already trying to treat effluent out, because we want to make sure that effluent stays in that soil system the longest. 2 great questions in the chat. Both I'm going to get to, I promise, real quick. So maintaining your system. Pump your tank, keep your bacteria healthy and happy. And when I say your bacteria, I mean your bacteria. So I mentioned fecal coliform earlier, comes from manure sources. Fecal coliform from animals. You are all animals. And that coliform bacteria that leaves your body is one of the main breakdown components that makes your septic system function. So all of that bacteria you have in your body, it leaves, you flush it down the toilet, and that's what's making your septic system go. So if you are ever worried about your septic system, you're like, I have had to have use some bleach in the house. I've been using these cleaners, these antimicrobial cleaners. I want you to poop at home. Don't poop at work, poop at home. Because you are the bacteria. You are the starter your tank needs. You are what keeps it going. You re-energize it every time you're in the bathroom. So the other thing with this one is there's a very big difference in these 2 tanks. One of these is on the other side of the mountain, and I'm referring to the colder part of our state, not the coastal. And you see how deep that is? That septic system is down there. Now that septic system could be in Benton County too. I know it's not because of the photo and that, but septic systems can be very deep. The first picture, that is a Benton County septic system. That one is right at the surface. So you could have a septic system that's pretty deep, pretty shallow. So if you don't know where your system is, or how deep your tank is, or any of those kind of key pieces, I recommend calling a septic pumper to come out, and that person can go ahead and they can help you figure out. They're going to charge you a fee for it. They'll help you figure out where your septic system is, both the tank and the drain field, so that you can kind of protect it. But pumping your tank is how you maintain it. Now, we have a publication on our Wellwater website that I have at the very top slide that gives you there's a publication on there that suggested pumping intervals. And that one has from like a 500-gallon tank to like a 3,000-gallon tank, from 1 to 12 people in your household. But this is where most people fall. So your tank size should be on the paper. If you don't know, this would be one of those things that a septic pumper can also help you figure out. But if you have paperwork about your septic, this can kind of give you an idea. Septic systems are required by the county. The size of the tanks are basically from kind of in the current climate is they recommend a septic tank size based upon the number of bedrooms in your house. And right now we like to kind of generally in industry, we're going to suggest a tank size that's a little bit bigger, because people tend to like to add on to their homes, especially kind of in those rural properties. Felicia asked if you can use cleansers with bleach if you poop at home. 100%. Don't overuse the bleach, but if you need to use some bleach, as long as you're pooping at home, you're good. You are putting that bacteria back in every time. So sometimes I've had people say, well, I've never pumped my tank and it's fine. And maybe you have a bigger tank. Maybe you use a little less water than the average household. But eventually, if you don't pump your tank, it will fail. And most of the time, the pumper will come out and they're like, oh my gosh, you're like right there. You're on the edge of failure. And we don't want that. We want, that effluent to go through the maximum amount of treatment, because then when it goes out into the environment and goes back to the soil layers, you're not increasing things like nitrate and other things like that. And we do track one of the ways they look for if septic tanks are leaking. I mentioned like we might see surface water interaction happening, but they also track coliform bacteria in surface water, but also caffeine. So I will just have like 2-3 more slides. What do I plant? Perennial annual flowers, ground covers. Avoid planting all trees, shrubs, or vegetable garden, especially the vegetable garden, because once your drain field fails, if you have root vegetables, you may not be aware that you have coliform bacteria and other things coming up in your garden. And these are kind of the big things, overloading. So doing too much laundry in a day. This septic systems, especially in the winter, are not designed for you to do 4, 5, 6 loads of laundry. 2 to 3, 2 if you have standard appliances, 3 if you have high efficiency. There's some of these things you cannot fix, things like water leaks. If you're just pushing water through the system, that's not going to help because it doesn't have the good bacteria. So we want to fix those leaks. Driving over your drain field compacts the soil. Garbage disposals. This is tree roots. This was a sample that we did. So this is where they just started to come in, and then 10 months later. So you do not want big trees around your drain field. And remember that typically the roots extend to where the canopy is, and always give that a little bit of a buffer. And I mentioned like willows and aspens. This is one of those things where on this page, flushable wipes, I know they say they're flushable. Do not flush them. Don't flush them if you're in town. Don't flush them if you're out on a rural property, any of that. And the second thing people are surprised by are dry laundry detergent. The detergent itself is typically adhered to a clay particle. And so that clay particle would just add to your sludge layer because that's not going to break down. And I mentioned the that the symbol right here. These are the things that if you use can kill bacteria in your tank. So we don't want you to overuse them. But again, if you are still providing your inputs all the time, then you will be okay. And folks always ask me about additives. There's no substitute for pumping. There's nothing you can flush down other than your poop that's going to magically stimulate your tank to do any breakdown. There's nothing you can put in there, any enzymes that are going to like eat through that sludge. Remember, some of that's like soil. Like you can't just break that down any faster. Rid-X is the one I choose to pick on because they're one of the most common. This is their advertising. At the bottom of this, you can see it says occasional pumping may also be required for good septic system maintenance. Occasional pumping is almost all you need if you're only flushing the 3 Ps, pee, poop, and toilet paper down your toilet, and you're not dumping grease down your drains, that kind of thing. Then you should be okay, honestly. So kind of my tips: find your septic system, protect it, and pump it. And just a little caveat here with homeowners insurance. This is for both your well and septic. Something that we have learned from the 2020 wildfires is a lot of people were very underinsured. So they might be able to have replaced their homes. And in some cases, the insurance company said, here's your check. We're not giving you any more money. But they didn't have the riders to replace utilities. So in order to rebuild your home, you already have to have your well and your septic system put in on your lot. Unfortunately, you could maybe afford with your settlement to put those 2 things in, but then you didn't have any money to put an actual house on there. So there has been a lot of effort in the last few years to try and get people back on their homes. And unfortunately, a lot of the being held up is that people did not have the insurance to replace these utilities first. And then we do have some issues with, like, there's actually just like not enough contractors right now to be able to put them in. Septic and well contractors are very, very busy. So I will stay for questions. I will also make sure that this is sent out. If you want to evaluate me, you can. My bosses like to know if I actually am out answering questions. And Frank Words, I love Frank Words, condoms and tampons. Yeah, so you can flush tampons if you desire. They're not going to clog up the system. They're designed to be flushed. Their applicators are not. Just FYI, when they come to pump your tank, they'll know that a woman lives in the household. So if you're okay with that, totally fine. They've seen much worse. Condoms should not be flushed because they do not break down. There's a lot of jokes out there about condoms plugging up septic systems and other plumbing, and like the other significant other does not. My husband's computer is ringing randomly. I'm sorry about that. That's a very big of a surprise. Yeah, things that shouldn't be flushed, condoms, things, cigarette butts, cat litter, none of that is flushable. If you see something that says it's flushable on there, it's not flushable, or you could flush it technically, but you can't, it's not going to break down. Like, it's going to be in that tank when that guy comes, that lady comes to pump your septic tank. And toilet paper. So there's not a best type, but I will say that I have done some scientific research of toilet paper in, jars that gets to sit there for a while. You should do this with your own toilet paper if you're worried. Do like a bowl of water, put how much you would use in a really good bathroom trip. Give it 20-30 minutes, come back, run your hands through it. If it's starting to break down, give a little more time. If it doesn't break down at all, might be time for a new brand. There is one brand that little ladies, cartoon ladies quilt. That one is notorious for causing issues in septic systems. Rid-X is the only thing I'm willing to pick on pretty consistently. And then I will say that a lot of folks use Costco toilet paper. I myself also use Costco toilet paper. And I never thought I would. I mean, I talk about toilet paper all the time, but after the beginning of the pandemic, I spent a lot more time talking about toilet paper than I ever imagined, and so did everybody else. But also, just keep in mind that they have multiple companies or manufacturers. So toilet paper that you get here may be manufactured from a different place than like if you were in a different state. So don't just assume that there's consistency across the brand. So sometimes doing that like quick test is good. Or if you notice that it's just not breaking down or if the texture feels different. But also, you know, if I want you to poop at home, maybe spend the extra couple bucks, get the cushier toilet paper. It's funny, those cushier toilet papers actually tend to have shorter fibers and they tend to break down a little bit better. So I do not, Dale, I don't do assessments for a fee. I do have some home assessments that you can do, and occasionally I have time to go out to properties and help folks with assessments, but I do have some home ones that you can kind of do some check boxes and see your risks. Calcium carbonate, if you want to remove it from the water, you would do a water softener. If you want to just scrub it off, CLR and things like that are the best to taking those off. Is there maintenance for your well pump? It depends upon the pump. They're all a little bit different. Yeah, it will just stop working one day. Unfortunately, they sometimes they'll give an indication that they're starting to go out. You'll maybe hear it be a little bit different. The pitch will be a little bit different. But most of the time, unfortunately, with a water system, you turn on the faucet and there's no water and you go, what the heck is it today? So that's why I suggested like paying yourself a water bill, because then you're going to have to call a well contractor. Yeah, bidets too. And then Sarah, Donna, did you want to jump back on? Was there any programs you guys had that you want to talk about? I apologize for going over. I just like septics and wells so much.
No, this was amazing information. I know as a new, someone new to this stuff, I learned a ton. It was like frantically jotting notes down the whole time. So I did mention at the beginning, this has been recorded. I'll be posting it on our website, and you will get a link as someone who registered for this webinar. You'll get a link to access the recording probably next week. So if you, didn't take notes or, want to revisit something, that'll be available. And Chrissy mentioned she would send the PowerPoint too. So Chrissy, if you send that to me, I'll include that on the website with the recording, so you can look through those great diagrams as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and Chrissy, do you have, would you like to put your email in the chat just so folks can, send you an email later if they want to create a WhatsApp group? I like it.
So I do work for the state of Oregon. So you already, and the county, I'm funded by your tax service dollars. So you have already paid for my time and effort on your tax bill every year. There's a line that says Benton, Lane, Marion, and Polk County all have that. We'll say something about an OSU extension 4-H service district. The 4-H tends to go first because we pay for the kids first. And then what's left over from that, they divvy out to us others. So you have already paid for my services, and I am here pretty much anytime you want to call. I would say email is probably the best because I am stretched over so many counties. Or if you call, leave a voicemail, that voicemail gets transcribed into my email and then sent to this magic device that I carry with me almost all the time. And I typically work really hard. If I see something comes in that is an emergency, like you've gotten that positive coliform test, that kind of thing, those are going to get priority over somebody who maybe calls and is like, hey, I have hard water and I was just looking at like treatment systems. So, we try and prioritize that a little bit, and it can take me a couple days sometimes to get back to you, but I will eventually for sure. And I did mention those nitrate screening tests, half a cup of water and any clean container at our Benton County Extension office, if that's the closest one to you. It's on Research Way. Anytime we're open Monday through Friday, put in a container that you don't love, because if someone's not trained, they'll just take the sample. But most of the time we have a trained staff member who can do that test in about 10 minutes.
And I really encourage everyone, and if you want to kind of stay on top of events like that where you can get your water tested, or just general events in the community, subscribe to our newsletter, the Benton SWCD newsletter. OSU Extension, each county, I think, also has its own newsletter. So definitely cruise around and search for those newsletters and subscribe to those. And we like to share things happening with our partners such as OSU Extension. So that's, you know, our newsletter and theirs are some great places to stay in touch. So I really want to thank Chrissy again for her time and expertise. And like I said, I know I learned a ton. I'm sure everyone here learned a ton as well. Feel free to reach out to any of us if you still have questions that you didn't get answered or things come up with your systems. But other than that, I want to wish everyone a happy evening. Enjoy the sun, at least while it's cool outside. And thank you so much for being here, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording now.
Yeah, and I do see